This is a decision that only Ukrainians can make. The president is not empowered by anyone to swap Ukrainian land while meeting with Putin. And I just hope he does not make the mistake of agreeing to that, because there will never be any giving away of territory.
Looking back over the last 6 months, I was struck by the fact that we have been, close to a deal so many times, and it just has never manifested. How substantively has the situation changed in that time?
Tragically, not much, in my view. There's been a lot of rhetoric swings, right? Especially President Trump. He speaks highly of Putin for a while, and then he shifts and he pivots to praising Zelensky and criticizing Putin. We're now back, days before this meeting in Alaska, where he's become more critical of Zelensky again and softer on Putin. But all of those ups and downs with respect to rhetoric, I don't see concretely a lot that has changed with respect to the actual facts of a ceasefire, yet alone an end to this war. When I look at what President Putin says and what people close to him say, I see very little daylight between their position today and what he said on the eve of his barbaric invasion of Ukraine. I hope there's trade space there. I hope that maybe in a meeting with Trump that might change. But in public, I think very little has changed regarding his position.
So this has all been sort of rhetorical swings. I mean, in terms of these secondary tariffs, how much have they impressed you, or any changes in the oil and gas markets? Do you think these have any substantive effect?
Not yet, because again, they've been more rhetoric and not actual policy implementation. And I want to underscore that I appreciate the fact that President Trump is trying to end this war. He's putting effort into it. That's something, I think a lot of people want to see this war end. And so that the President of the United States is engaging to do that is a good thing. But when you look at the actual policies, not what he says, but what he does, I just don't think he has a strategy to achieve that objective. So with respect to sanctions, he said a lot of tough things. He said we're going to impose secondary sanctions on India and China. And first he said that would be at 100%. And then he backed away from that to say left out China. And then he said just India. But then he reduced it to 25%. But then he gave himself 3 more weeks before implementing it. And that just is a metaphor for what I think has been a rather ineffective negotiating strategy. And more broadly speaking, I would say that his general strategy has been to appease Putin, to give him concessions, and to pressure President Zelensky and the Ukrainians. And that strategy has not yielded results. I would say just the opposite. It has emboldened Putin to keep asking for more, so much so that you now have this absurd position that Putin is asking for Ukraine to withdraw from territory that it still holds. That's how much he's emboldened, and that's in the name of swap. So I hope that the president will pivot away from that strategy. I hope that he'll actually implement real sanctions, including the secondary sanctions that you mentioned, many other things he could do. And most importantly, I hope that he would reconsider his policy to not renew new weapons for Ukraine. Right now, he's just selling them to the Europeans. I think we, as part of our burden sharing, should also be giving weapons to Ukraine. Those would be signs that he's serious about upping the pressure on Putin rather than just always upping the pressure on Zelensky and the Ukrainians.
Before we go any further, please take a moment, hit the like and subscribe button below so you can stay up to date for future interviews like this. One thing I did notice, looking at interviews that you did back in, February and March, you commented on possibly this is kind of novelty of the people involved in diplomacy at the time. Yes. Has that changed? Have you noticed any shift in, the folks surrounding President Trump, Marco Rubio or Witkoff? Have you seen them get up to speed?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, I don't have a great answer. I can only judge it by what we see in the public, not what goes on behind closed doors. I would say just one thing kind of bureaucratically, and then one thing on the substance. Bureaucratically, it seems to me that the Trump administration is really challenged because they don't have a national security advisor. Secretary Rubio is doing both of those jobs. And I worked at the White House. My boss used to be the national security advisor when I was at the White House, and then the Secretary of State when I was in Moscow. And I can tell you, both of those jobs are full-time jobs. Even the most talented person in the world cannot do those two jobs together. And so I think what you see, and we've seen a few instances of that, is that the interagency policy process is not working under President Trump. And what does that phrase mean? That phrase means that to make big decisions, the national security advisor at his level, and when I was at the White House, it was at the lower levels where I did it, sits in the White House Situation Room next to the Secretary of State, next to the Secretary of Defense, the Director of the CIA, Secretary of Treasury, and the Vice President, by the way. That's called a Principals Committee meeting, and they deliberate about what the policy should be, and then they take it to the president. And when the president joins that meeting, it's called a National Security Council meeting, and that's when everybody gets there and deliberates. What we've seen with Ukraine is that process doesn't seem to be happening. For instance, when the Pentagon out of nowhere delayed military assistance to Ukraine, and the president was asked point blank, did you do this, Mr. President? He said, no, I'm not. And then he was asked who did it, and he said he didn't know. That just says that the system's not working. And I think the president would be well advised to have a full-time national security advisor. It could even be Rubio, by the way, and just give the Secretary of State job to somebody else. But you can't have one person doing that job at the same time. And with respect to that, I also see little evidence that the special envoy, Mr. Witkoff, interacts with the rest of the government, including the special envoy for Ukraine, Keith Kellogg. They should be interacting all the time, coordinating their positions. And I just don't see evidence of that. I see Mr. Witkoff flying to Moscow, treating Putin like an old friend, as if like friendships lead to outcomes good for the American people. They never do. And I have seen no evidence that he's actually negotiating with Putin. Instead, I've seen that he's acting kind of as the mailman. And if press reports from last week are to be believed, it seems like he even garbled that he didn't even understand what Putin was offering. So I think that system needs to be tightened up. And the last thing I would say on process is it's generally the case, and most certainly was the case when I worked at the White House for President Obama, that you bring the presidents to a summit at the end of a negotiation process. For instance, we negotiated something called the New START Treaty, the last major nuclear weapons agreement between Russia and the United States that reduced nuclear weapons in the world by 30%, by the way. So concrete outcome that we thought was good for the United States, we thought was good for the world. We, lower level officials like me, we did the negotiations leading up to the end of that treaty. And then it was only at the end of that process, in a signing ceremony in Prague, that President Obama and President Medvedev at the time in 2010 flew to sign that agreement. The Trump folks seem to have it the opposite. Trump's going to meet with Putin first. Nothing's been agreed. And then maybe that will lead to other outcomes. And, I hope I wish the president well. I hope he is, going to be ready to cut a deal, to do something concrete that advances American interests and the interests of our European allies and Ukrainians. But I just want to report that usually it's done the opposite way. An agreement is negotiated first and the president signs it at the end.
I'm glad you brought this up, because you do have the rather unique experience of having sat across the table in negotiations with several of these core casts of characters. What could you tell me about that experience? What could you tell me about, Vladimir Putin or Lavrov or any of these folks that only somebody who has actually sat across the table from them and had to hammer something complicated out would necessarily know?
So I have been in the room with Putin during negotiations, very serious negotiations. And let me start with him because he's the main player. Lavrov is a very secondary character compared to Putin, but he's a very savvy negotiator himself. I'll get to him in a minute. But Putin, a few very important things. First, he is highly motivated by ideas in these negotiations, not by transactions, not by money. He's an ideologue. He is committed to expanding the Russian empire. He thinks, and he may be right, I don't know, but he thinks that 50 years from now, when Russian history books are written, they'll write about what he did to expand the Russian empire. I don't know if it would be called empire then, I hope not, but it might be. That is what he's motivated by, not by some definition of some short-term economic interests or security interests. This notion that this is about NATO is completely absurd because Putin knows, and I've been in the room when he's talked about it, there's no security threat to the Russian Federation from Ukraine. Second, he knows the portfolio well. He knows where all of the fighting is happening in all those cities along that long border. He knows that well, especially when compared to President Trump. Third, he is a student of history. I think he manipulates it. It's not the history I know, and it's not the history that I think real historians write about. But he will talk about facts from the 18th century and the 19th century, even the 14th century. He'll go on and on about all these things, and we've seen it from time to time. He did it, for instance, with Tucker Carlson in his podcast with him, where he's going back 500 years, and he'll go on for a long time. I've seen him do this, and if you don't know what he's talking about, you'll just kind of nod and pretend you know what's going about. But then the punchline will be to say, you see, this is why we have to do this now. Mr. President, I wouldn't be surprised if he said that. Of course, you understand that Ukrainians have always been part of the Russian Empire. They've always been part of the Russian nation. They're just Russians with accents. And I'll invoke something from 400 years ago.
Yaroslav Mudry, конечно, yeah.
Exactly, those kind of things. Yeah. But I'm a little worried that President Trump might know those kinds of things. And then the last thing I'll say about his just negotiating styles, he thinks time is on his side. He's not eager to get a deal in Alaska. There's no pressure on him whatsoever to get a deal. And that creates a real asymmetry with Americans. And I would say the same about us, but most certainly Donald Trump. We're always very eager to get a deal. We are always impatient. That is I would say, a very different style of negotiation. And therefore, I think that gives him leverage over those who are eager to get a deal. And President Trump is way too eager to get a deal. He doesn't care about the details. He just wants to be the guy that ended the war. That seems, listening to him talk, all he cares about. And that gives Putin a lot of advantages going into this meeting.
So if you're trying to amend or edit Trump's art of the deal playbook, say, how you think he's going to go into these negotiations, what are, the top line corrections that you would make?
A couple of things. That's a great question. One, and I would just say this, I have Art of the Deal. I've looked at it, but I haven't read it recently. But I have read a lot about effective diplomacy. And, for a while, I even practiced diplomacy. And there's a concept called coercive diplomacy. And the idea is you had to have a pressure track also with an engagement track. If you just engaged without any pressure, you didn't put it, you were unlikely to get an outcome with your interlocutor. And so I think Trump needs to increase the volume activity on the pressure track on Russia. He talks about it, as we talked about with sanctions, but he hasn't done it. I think increasing sanctions, for instance, sanctioning all of the ships in the shadow fleet that Russia is using now to export its oil. Just do that today. You don't have to wait for anything, Mr. President. Do that today. Second, seize the Russian central bank assets that are still sitting in American banks. We don't know exactly how much it is, but it's in the billions. Seize those today. That will get President Putin's attention, and give them to the Ukrainians. And then third, and I would say most importantly, make clear that we, the United States of America, are going to continue military and economic assistance to Ukraine. We're not just going to leave that burden to our European allies. And that would suggest to Putin that maybe time is not on his side, and it might help to focus his attention when he meets with President Trump in Alaska.
That's the provision of weapons rather than just public support, or is that?
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Well, I suppose here's kind of the thorniest of issues, right? And this is something that earlier, I believe it was today, Zelensky he made this announcement because he felt this pressure of the territorial swap, where he's saying we are not going to give up any territory. What do you think about the prospect of Ukraine ceding territory that is currently occupied? Do you think this is some sort of inevitability? What's your thought?
Well, first, just to remind, because sometimes, not where you are, but here in America, sometimes people are confused by this swap. It's swap of Ukrainian land for Ukrainian land. It's not swap of Ukrainian land for Russian land. Obviously, that is not palatable for President Zelensky. He's been very clear on that. Second thing I would say, and as a piece of advice for President Trump, this is a decision that only Ukrainians can make. The president is not empowered by anyone to swap Ukrainian land while meeting with Putin. And I just hope he does not make the mistake of agreeing to that and then coming out to a press conference and saying that's what they agreed. That would be a disaster, because he does not have the authority to do that, and he should not do that. Third, as I intimated, at the end of the day, this is a decision that the Ukrainian people and their democratically elected representatives have to make. It's not my role as a professor at Stanford University in California to make. But what I would say, just listening closely to what Ukrainians have said, is there will never be any giving away of territory. Never. And I respect that position. The question is, could there be a ceasefire where President Zelensky could agree to only seek reunification through peaceful means? That's a kind of compromise that would be extremely difficult for President Zelensky to do, but I could imagine it. But it has to be done for something concrete in return for Ukraine and for Ukrainian security. And I've always said that the way to do that would be membership into NATO for Ukraine. That would be something very concrete that would make Ukraine more secure. And I know that the President of the United States is not thinking about that, but I don't want to abandon that, because I think in the long term, if you really want a long-term peace along that border, a membership into NATO for Ukraine has to be a part of the equation.
The Kyiv Independent can only do what we do thanks to members like you. If you would like to become a member, the link is in the description below.